Welcome to our channel. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today, because we're about to embark on an extraordinary journey through time. If you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next, and here's something that's going to blow your mind. End of today's story. You'll know a secret that archaeologists are still trying to piece together, so drop a comment below and tell me, what's the most mysterious historical discovery you've ever heard of? I read every single comment, and I love hearing your thoughts. Today's story is unlike anything we've covered before. It's the tale of Lucius, an embalmer in Roman Egypt, and a secret so dangerous it was buried for 2,000 years. This isn't just another archaeological discovery. This is a story that could rewrite history books. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let's dive into one of the most incredible mysteries ever unearthed. My name is Lucius, and I am a preparer of the dead in Roman Egyptus. One night, a powerful family brought me their daughter, Lyra. They paid in gold and silence. But the girl, she was not like the others. The rites they demanded were foreign, whispered in a tongue that was not of Rome or the Nile. I was sworn to an oath to seal their forbidden secret within the stone. I did my duty, burying a truth that could have shattered an imperial dynasty. For 2 millennia, I thought it was safe. Now, your machines have breached the seal. You see the surprising mummy. You marvel at the unusual artifacts, but you don't know the story. Let me tell you what you've truly unearthed. Chapter 1: The Night of Secrets. The moon hung like a silver coin over Alexandria that night, casting long shadows across the marble columns of my workshop. I had been preparing the dead for nearly 20 years, following the ancient traditions passed down from my father and his father before him. The art of mummification was sacred work, requiring precision, respect, and above all, discretion. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what would unfold on that fateful evening in the year 123 of our Lord Emperor Hadrian's reign. It was well past the 9th hour when they arrived. The sound of horses' hooves on cobblestone echoed through the narrow streets, accompanied by the soft jingle of expensive harnesses and the whispered commands of well-trained servants. I had been expecting them. A message had arrived earlier that day, written on papyrus so fine it could only have come from the wealthiest households in the city. The seal bore a mark I didn't recognize, but the gold coins that accompanied the message spoke louder than any family crest. 3 figures emerged from the covered litter that had been carried by 6 strong men. The first was clearly the patriarch of the family, tall, dignified, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His toga was of the finest silk, dyed with Tyrian purple that marked him as a man of considerable wealth and status. Behind him came a woman, heavily veiled, her movements suggesting deep grief barely held in check. But it was the third figure that caught my attention. A younger man, perhaps 25 years of age, whose eyes darted nervously around my workshop as if expecting danger to emerge from every shadow. Between them, carried on a simple wooden stretcher, lay the reason for their midnight visit. The body was wrapped in linen of extraordinary quality, so fine that it seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. Even through the wrapping, I could see that this was a young woman, small in stature, with delicate features that spoke of noble birth. What struck me immediately was the care with which she had been prepared for transport. This was not the hasty wrapping of a sudden death, but the meticulous work of someone who understood the importance of preservation. "You are Lucius?" the patriarch asked, his voice carrying the authority of generations of command. When I nodded, he continued, "I am Marcus Aurelius Severus, and this is my daughter, Lyra. She died 3 days ago, and we require your services for her final preparation." I had heard the name Severus whispered in the markets and taverns of Alexandria. They were one of the oldest Roman families in Egypt, with connections that reached back to the earliest days of Roman rule. Marcus himself was said to be a close advisor to the provincial governor, a man whose word could make or break careers throughout the eastern provinces. Yet here he stood in my humble workshop, asking for my help in the dead of night. "Of course, Dominus," I replied, using the formal address appropriate for a man of his station. "I am honored to serve your family in this time of grief. However, I must ask, why bring her to me at such an hour? Surely a family of your standing has access to the finest embalmers in the city, men who work in the great temples and serve the most noble houses." The question hung in the air like incense smoke. Marcus exchanged a glance with the veiled woman, his wife, I assumed, before answering. "Our requirements are specific. We have been told that you are a man who understands the value of discretion, who can perform the ancient rites without asking unnecessary questions. We are prepared to pay handsomely for such understanding." As he spoke, the younger man produced a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. He set it on my work table with a weight that suggested it contained more money than I typically earned in several months. The message was clear. This was not a normal embalming, and they expected my complete cooperation and silence. I had built my reputation on exactly such discretion. In a city like Alexandria, where Romans, Greeks, Egyptians, and dozens of other peoples mingled in an endless dance of commerce and politics, an embalmer often learned secrets that could topple governments or destroy families. The wealthy and powerful came to me precisely because they knew I understood the value of silence. But as I looked at the rapt form of young Lyra, something in the air seemed different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my arms stand on end. "What specific rites do you require?" I asked, though part of me already suspected that the answer would be unlike anything I had encountered before. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice to barely above a whisper. "The traditional Roman rites will not suffice. Lyra was special. Her mother's bloodline traces back to the old kingdoms, to the time before Rome, before Alexander, before even the great pharaohs. There are ceremonies that must be performed, protections that must be put in place. We have brought the necessary materials and instructions." The veiled woman finally spoke, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. Not Roman, not Greek, not Egyptian, but something older, something that seemed to echo from the depths of history itself. She must be prepared according to the old ways, the ways that ensure the dead remain at rest. There are those who would seek to disturb her sleep, to use what lies within her for their own purposes. This must not be allowed to happen. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. In my years of preparing the dead, I had encountered many strange requests, many unusual rituals demanded by grieving families. But this felt different. This felt dangerous. Yet the gold on my table was real, and I had learned long ago that in Alexandria, survival often depended on knowing when to ask questions and when to simply do as requested. "I will need to examine the body first," I said, falling back on the practical requirements of my trade, "to determine what preparations are necessary and how long the process will take." Marcus nodded, but as I moved toward the stretcher, he placed a firm hand on my arm. "Before you begin, you must swear an oath, not just to discretion. Any skilled embalmer can promise that. You must swear by the gods of Rome and Egypt, by your ancestors and your descendants, that what you see and do here tonight will never be spoken of to any living soul. The secret dies with you, Lucius. Do you understand?" The weight of his words settled over me like a burial shroud. This was more than a request for silence. This was a binding oath that would tie my fate to whatever secret lay wrapped in those fine linens. But the gold glittered in the lamplight, and I had mouths to feed, a workshop to maintain, and a reputation to uphold. Sometimes a man must make choices that he cannot fully understand in the moment. "I swear by Jupiter Optimus Maximus, by Isis and Osiris, by the shades of my fathers and the future of my sons, that your secret will be safe with me," I said, the formal words of binding falling from my lips with a weight that seemed to make the very air grow heavy. As soon as the oath was complete, the atmosphere in the workshop changed. The three visitors relaxed slightly, as if some great tension had been released. Marcus stepped back and gestured toward the stretcher. "Then, let us begin. Time is precious, and there are preparations that must be completed before dawn." I approached the wrapped form of Lyra with the reverence due to the dead and the caution born of 20 years' experience. But as my hands touched the linen wrappings, I felt something that made me pause. There was a warmth there, subtle but unmistakable, as if some spark of life still flickered within the supposedly dead girl. I looked up at Marcus, a question forming on my lips, but his stern expression warned me against speaking it aloud. Instead, I began the careful process of unwrapping the body, following the traditional methods but moving with extra care. What I found beneath those layers of fine linen would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life and change everything I thought I knew about the nature of life, death, and the thin boundaries between them. But that revelation, dear listeners, must wait for our next chapter. The night was still young, and the true mysteries were only beginning to unfold in my workshop by the banks of the Nile. Chapter 2. The Forbidden Ritual. As I carefully peeled away the layers of linen, the lamplight revealed something that defied every principle of death I had learned in my 20 years as an embalmer. Lyra's skin held a pallor that was not quite the gray of death, but rather the pale ivory of deep sleep. Her features were delicate, aristocratic, with high cheekbones that spoke of noble breeding, but it was her hands that first caught my attention. They were positioned in a way I had never seen before, fingers interlaced in a complex pattern that seemed to form some kind of sacred symbol. More disturbing still was the complete absence of the usual signs of decomposition. 3 days had passed since her supposed death, yet there was no smell of decay, no discoloration beyond that strange pale ivory tone. Her flesh felt cool but not cold, and when I pressed gently against her arm to test the condition of the muscles, I could swear I felt the faintest suggestion of resistance as if she were merely sleeping deeply rather than dead. She appears to be remarkably well preserved, I said carefully, glancing up at the three watchers. The preparation work done before bringing her here was exceptional. May I ask who performed the initial rites? The veiled woman stepped forward, and for the first time, I caught a glimpse of her face beneath the heavy fabric. She was older than I had initially thought, perhaps 50 years of age, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge that made me uncomfortable. When she spoke, that strange accent became more pronounced, as if she were translating thoughts from some other language. "I performed the preservation myself," she said. "I am Claudius Severus, but that is not the name I was born with. My people have knowledge of death and preservation that predates your Roman methods by centuries. What you see is not the work of natron and spices, but of older arts, older understandings." I felt my hands tremble slightly as I continued my examination. In the region around Lyra's heart, I found something that made me step back in shock. There, pressed against her skin, was an amulet unlike anything I had ever seen. It was not Egyptian, not Roman, not Greek. The metal seemed to shift and change color in the lamplight, and the symbols carved into its surface hurt my eyes to look at directly, as if they were not meant for mortal sight. "What is this?" I whispered, not daring to touch the strange object. Marcus moved to stand beside me, his face grave. "That is why we have come to you in secret, Lucius. That amulet has been in Claudia's family for generations beyond counting. It is older than Rome, older than the pharaohs, older perhaps than civilization itself, and it is the reason Lyra cannot be buried according to normal rites." Claudia began to speak in that foreign tongue, her voice taking on a rhythmic, almost hypnotic quality. The words seemed to resonate in the stone walls of my workshop, creating harmonics that made my teeth ache. As she chanted, the younger man, whom I now realized must be Lyra's brother, began unpacking items from a series of cloth bundles he had been carrying. The objects he revealed were unlike anything in my experience as an embalmer. There were vials of liquid that seemed to glow with their own inner light, powders that shifted color as they moved, and tools made from metals I couldn't identify. Most disturbing of all was a scroll written on some kind of skin that definitely did not come from any animal I recognized. The writing on it seemed to move and shift when I wasn't looking directly at it.
"These are the materials needed for the true preservation,"
Marcus explained, "not just of her body, but of what lies within her. Lyra was born with a gift, Lucius. She could see things that others could not, know things that had not yet happened, speak with voices that belonged to the long dead. In life, this gift made her valuable to those who sought power through forbidden knowledge. In death, it makes her dangerous." I found myself backing away from the table, my professional composure finally cracking. "Dominus, what you describe sounds like sorcery. I am a simple embalmer, not a practitioner of the dark arts. Perhaps you should seek help from the priests of Isis or the followers of Thoth. They would be better equipped to handle such matters." The younger man, Lyra's brother, spoke for the first time, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "The priests cannot help us. They serve gods who are bound by laws and limitation. What we deal with tonight exists outside such boundaries. My sister's gift comes from bloodlines that stretch back to the time before the gods themselves walked among mortals. There are no temples that can contain what she carries. No priests who understand the forces at work here. Claudia had finished her chanting and now approached the table with one of the glowing vials. Lucius, you have sworn an oath, and we have paid you well, but more than that, you are now part of this secret whether you wish it or not. The moment you touched her skin, the moment you looked upon the amulet, you became connected to what must be done here. There is no turning back. As if to emphasize her words, I suddenly felt a strange tingling in my hands. The same hands that had touched Lyra's skin. Looking down, I saw that my fingertips were glowing with the same faint light that emanated from the vials. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever power resided in the dead girl was already beginning to affect me. "What is happening to me?" I demanded, though part of me already feared the answer. "You are being marked," Marcus said solemnly. "Marked as one who has been chosen to guard the secret. This is why we needed someone like you, Lucius. Someone skilled in the arts of preservation, but also someone strong enough to bear the burden of what must be hidden." Claudia began preparing the strange liquids, mixing them in proportions that seemed to follow no earthly logic. As she worked, she explained what was to come. "The preservation we perform tonight will not simply prevent decay. It will create a barrier between the world of the living and the power that sleeps within Lyra. But that barrier requires a guardian. Someone who will carry the knowledge of where she lies and ensure that she remains undisturbed." The implications of her words began to sink in. This was not simply a matter of embalming a body and sealing it in a tomb. They were asking me to become part of some ancient conspiracy, to carry a secret that could apparently shake the foundations of the empire itself. Yet as I looked at the glowing marks on my hands, I realized that choice had already been taken from me. "Tell me what you need me to do," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. What followed was the strangest night of my life. Under Claudia's direction, I began a preservation process that bore only superficial resemblance to traditional mummification. Instead of removing the organs, we sealed them within the body using the glowing liquids. Instead of drying the flesh with natron, we anointed it with oils that seemed to sink into the skin and disappear, leaving behind a subtle luminescence that was visible only in complete darkness. The most disturbing part came when we reached the amulet. Claudia instructed me to wrap it in strips of the strange skin scroll, binding it against Lyra's heart with knots that followed patterns she drew in the air with her finger. As I worked, I could feel the object pulsing with a rhythm that almost matched a heartbeat, and the symbols on its surface began to glow more brightly. Throughout the process, Lyra's brother maintained a constant vigil, reading from another scroll in that same unknown language. His words seemed to weave a web of protection around us, but I could sense other presences gathering in the shadows beyond my workshop. Things that were drawn by the power we were working with, but held at bay by the protective chants. As dawn approached, the final phase of the ritual began. Claudia produced a series of small clay tablets, each inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. These were to be placed at specific points around Lyra's body, creating what she called a binding circle that would contain the power within her even in death. "Remember, Lucius," Marcus said as we prepared to wrap the body in its final shroud, "what we have done here tonight must never be spoken of. The knowledge of where she is buried, the nature of the rituals performed, the very existence of the amulet. All of this dies with you, but know that you have helped preserve something that could either save the world or destroy it, depending on who finds it. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the windows of my workshop, we completed the wrapping of Lyra's body. But this was not the end of the night's work. It was merely the beginning of a secret that would span 2 millennia and ultimately lead to the archaeological discovery that has brought her story to light once again. But before we could seal her away forever, there was one more revelation waiting. One that would explain why this young woman's death was considered dangerous enough to threaten an entire dynasty. And that revelation, my friends, will have to wait for our next chapter. I hope you're finding this story as fascinating as I am. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think is really going on with Lyra and that mysterious amulet. Your theories might be closer to the truth than you realize. Chapter 3. The Ancient Bloodline. As we prepared to move Lyra's wrapped body to its final resting place, Claudia made a decision that would change everything I thought I understood about the Roman world. She pulled back her veil completely, revealing not just her face, but a series of intricate tattoos that covered her neck and disappeared beneath her clothing. The markings were unlike anything I had ever seen. Not Egyptian hieroglyphs, not Roman numerals, not Greek letters, but symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight as if they were alive. Before we seal her away forever, Claudia said, her voice carrying a weight of centuries, you must understand what you are truly protecting. Lyra was not simply a Roman girl with unusual gifts. She was the last of a bloodline that stretches back to the time before recorded history, to the days when the world was young and the barriers between realms were thin. Marcus moved to stand beside his wife, and for the first time, I noticed that he too bore marks, subtle scars on sun. His hands that formed patterns similar to those tattooed on Claudia's skin. Tell him, my love, he said softly. Tell him the truth of what we guard. Claudia began to speak, and as she did, the very air in my workshop seemed to thicken with the weight of ancient secrets. My people were old when the first pharaoh raised his crown in Egypt. We were ancient when the Greeks sailed the wine-dark sea to Troy. We existed in the shadows of history, preserving knowledge and power, but the world was not ready to understand. We called ourselves the keepers of the threshold, for we guarded the boundaries between what is and what should not. Lyra was born on the night of a convergence, when the stars aligned in patterns that occur only once every 1,000 years. From the moment of her birth, she could see through the veils that separate the worlds. She spoke with the voices of the dead, saw visions of futures that had not yet come to pass, and could touch the minds of those who lived in distant lands. The younger man, whom I now learned was called Gaius, took up the tale. But her gifts came with a terrible price. There are things that exist in the spaces between worlds, entities that hunger for a way into our reality. Lyra's abilities made her a beacon to these creatures, a doorway they could use to cross over into our realm. As she grew older, her power grew stronger, and so did the attention she attracted from things that should remain forever banished. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. You mean to say that she died because of these entities? Not died, Claudia corrected, her eyes filling with tears. that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Lyra chose to enter the deep sleep, to bind her consciousness to the amulet, and seal herself away before the creatures could use her as a gateway. It was the only way to protect not just our family, but the entire world from what would have come through if they had succeeded in claiming her. The implications of what she was telling me were staggering. This was not simply a matter of preserving a body. We were creating a prison for something that could potentially destroy civilization itself. And I, a simple embalmer from Alexandria, had been chosen to be the guardian of this terrible secret. But why me? I asked. Surely there are others better equipped to handle such responsibilities. Priests, scholars, men of power and influence who could better protect what you're asking me to guard. Marcus smiled grimly. That is exactly why it cannot be them, Lucius. Priests serve gods who have their own agendas. Scholars seek knowledge for its own sake, regardless of the consequences. Men of power and influence are constantly watched by enemies who would use any secret against them. But you are invisible to those who would seek to exploit Lyra's power. You are skilled enough to understand what must be done, but humble enough to keep the secret safe. Gaius produced another scroll, this one written in Latin but using symbols I recognized from the tattoos on his mother's skin. This contains the true history of our bloodline, going back over 3,000 years. It tells of the first keepers, who learned to communicate with beings from other realms and discovered the terrible price of such knowledge. It speaks of the great binding that was performed in the time of the pharaohs, when our ancestors sealed away something so dangerous that even its name was erased from all records. As he unrolled the scroll, I caught glimpses of text that made my eyes water to read directly. The words seemed to shift and change, as if they were written in a language that existed partially outside normal reality. But even from the fragments I could make out, a terrifying picture began to emerge. The keepers of the threshold had not simply been guardians of ancient wisdom. They had been humanity's first and last line of defense against entities that viewed our world as a feeding ground. These beings existed in dimensions parallel to our own, constantly seeking ways to cross over and establish footholds in our reality. Throughout history, certain individuals had been born with the ability to see across the dimensional barriers. And these gifted ones had always been both humanity's greatest hope and its greatest danger. The amulet that Lyra wears, Claudia continued, is one of 7 that were created in the earliest days of our order. Each one contains a fragment of the original binding spell that keeps the most dangerous entities locked away in their own realm. But the amulets are also keys. In the wrong hands, they could be used to open the very doors they were meant to keep closed. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a burial shroud. Not only was I being asked to guard the body of a young woman with supernatural abilities, but I was also being entrusted with an artifact that could potentially end the world if it fell into the wrong hands. Where are the other 6 amulets? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Scattered across the world, Marcus replied. Hidden in places known only to the surviving members of the bloodline. One lies beneath the foundations of the great lighthouse of Alexandria. Another was sealed in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings. A third was cast into the deepest part of the Mediterranean Sea. The locations of the others are known only to the heads of the surviving keeper families, and that knowledge is passed down only at the moment of death. Gaius rolled up the scroll and placed it in a specially prepared container. This record will be buried with Lyra, along with instructions for what must be done if she is ever discovered. The knowledge it contains is too dangerous to exist in the world of the living, but too important to be lost forever. As we prepared to leave my workshop and make our way to the secret burial site they had prepared, Claudia placed her hand on my shoulder. The touch sent a shock through my entire body, and suddenly I could see things that had been hidden from my sight before. The shadows in the corners of my workshop were not empty. They were filled with watching eyes, creatures that existed just outside normal perception, drawn by the power we had been working with throughout the night. "You see them now?" she said softly. "The Watchers, the hungry ones, the things that wait for any opportunity to cross over into our world. They know what we have done here tonight, and they will remember. From this moment forward, you will always be able to see them, but they will also always be watching you." The realization that I would spend the rest of my life aware of these lurking presences was almost more than I could bear. But as I looked at the peaceful form of Lyra, wrapped in her protective shroud, I understood that some burdens must be carried regardless of their weight. We loaded her body onto a cart that had been waiting in the alley behind my workshop, and began the journey to what would become her final resting place. But the location they had chosen and the additional protections they had prepared would prove to be even more extraordinary than anything I had witnessed so far. The night was far from over, and the most dangerous part of our work still lay ahead, for we were not simply burying a body. We were creating a fortress that would have to withstand the assault of entities that existed beyond time and space, beings that would never stop trying to claim what lay within that ancient sarcophagus. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Dark. The journey through Alexandria's sleeping streets was unlike any funeral procession I had ever been part of. We moved in complete silence, the cart's wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound on the cobblestones. But it wasn't the silence of the living that unnerved me. It was the constant whispers that seemed to follow us from the shadows, voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. As we made our way toward the outskirts of the city, I began to understand that the entities Claudia had spoken of were not simply watching us. They were actively trying to interfere with our mission. Street lamps flickered and died as we passed, leaving pools of unnatural darkness in our wake. Dogs began howling throughout the city, their cries taking on an almost human quality that made my skin crawl. Most disturbing of all, I could see shapes moving in my peripheral vision, things that vanished the moment I tried to look at them directly. "They grow bolder," Gaius muttered, his hand moving instinctively to a dagger at his belt. "The longer we remain in the open, the more attention we attract. We must reach the site before they gather enough strength to manifest physically." Claudia began chanting again, but this time the words were different, harsher, more commanding. As she spoke, a faint barrier of light seemed to form around our small procession, pushing back the encroaching shadows. But I could see the effort was taking a toll on her. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool night air, and her hands trembled with the strain of maintaining the protective ward. "How much further?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concern for his wife. "Not far now," she replied through gritted teeth. "The old quarry lies just beyond the next hill, but Lucius must understand. Once we reach the burial site, there will be no turning back. The ritual we perform there will bind him to the secret, as surely as if he had been born into our bloodline." As we crested the hill, I saw our destination spread out below us in the moonlight. The abandoned quarry had been carved into the limestone cliffs decades earlier, when Alexandria was still growing rapidly, and stone was needed for new construction, but the workers had dug too deep, breaking through into natural caverns that honeycombed the bedrock beneath the city. Strange accidents had plagued the site, men vanishing without trace, tools found arranged in impossible patterns, whispers echoing from empty tunnels. Eventually, the quarry had been abandoned and forgotten by all but a few. Now I understood why the Severus family had chosen this place. The natural caves provided perfect concealment, but more than that, the limestone itself seemed to have properties that interfered with the entity's ability to manifest. As we descended into the quarry, the whispers that had followed us through the city began to fade, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow even more unnerving. "The stone remembers," Claudia explained as we unloaded Lyra's body from the cart. "Limestone is formed from the compressed remains of ancient sea creatures, millions of years of death and transformation. It creates a natural barrier against things that exist outside the normal flow of time. Our ancestors knew this, which is why so many of the old burial sites were carved into similar stone. The entrance to the caves was hidden behind a carefully constructed rock fall that looked completely natural, but could be moved aside by those who knew the secret. As Marcus and Gaius worked to clear the passage, I found myself staring up at the stars, trying to process everything I had learned over the course of this impossible night. "You're wondering if you've gone mad," Claudia said softly, moving to stand beside me. "Wondering if this is all some elaborate fever dream brought on by too much wine or too little sleep. I felt the same way when I first learned the truth of what my family guarded." "How do you bear it?" I asked, "knowing that such things exist, that they're constantly watching and waiting for an opportunity to break through into our world?" She smiled, sadly. "The same way a soldier bears the knowledge that death waits on every battlefield, or a sailor accepts that the sea might claim him on any voyage. We do what we must, because someone must do it, and we find strength in knowing that our sacrifice protects those who will never know how close they came to destruction." The passage was clear now, revealing a tunnel that led deep into the heart of the cliff. Marcus lit a torch, and by its flickering light, I could see that the walls were covered with symbols similar to those I had seen on the scrolls and amulets. But these were older, carved directly into the living rock by hands that had worked here long before Rome ever dreamed of conquering Egypt. "This site has been used by the keepers for over 1,000 years, Gaius explained as we carried Lyra's body into the tunnel. "Each generation has added to the protections, layering ward upon ward until the very stone itself has become a fortress against the entities that would claim what lies within." The tunnel opened into a vast natural chamber, its ceiling lost in shadows above the reach of our torchlight. But it was not empty. Arranged throughout the cavern were dozens of stone sarcophagi, each one sealed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Some were clearly ancient, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of time. Others appeared more recent, their carvings still sharp and clear. "All keepers?" I asked, awed by the sight. "All who carried the burden of protecting the amulets," Marcus confirmed. "When a keeper dies, they are brought here to rest alongside their ancestors, but Lyra's case is different. She is not dead in the traditional sense, merely sleeping until the danger has passed, or until the world has grown strong enough to face what she guards." At the far end of the chamber stood a single empty sarcophagus, carved from black granite and covered with silver inlays that formed patterns too complex for my mind to fully comprehend. This, I realized, was where Lyra would spend the next 2 millennia, waiting for the day when archaeologists would breach the seals and awaken secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. But before we could place her in that final resting place, there was one more ritual to be performed, one that would ensure the protections held, even if the chamber itself was discovered. And this ritual would require a sacrifice from me that I was only beginning to understand. "Lucius," Claudia said, her voice echoing strangely in the vast space. "You have seen much tonight, learned secrets that few mortals ever know, but to complete the binding, to ensure that Lyra remains safely sealed away, you must give up something precious, a part of yourself that will remain here with her, standing guard even after your body has returned to dust." The implications of her words sent a chill through my bone, but as I looked around at the ancient sarcophagi, at the generations of keepers who had made similar sacrifices, I understood that this was the price of the knowledge I now carried. Some secrets were too dangerous to exist in the world without guardians, and some guardians were bound to their duty by ties that transcended death itself. What happened next would change not just my life, but my very soul, binding me to this place and this secret in ways that I would not fully understand until the moment of my own death decades later. But that transformation and the final sealing of Lyra's tomb must wait for our next chapter. I can see you're really getting into this mystery. What do you think Lucius had to sacrifice to complete the ritual? Drop your theories in the comments. I love reading your thoughts on these ancient mysteries. Chapter 5: The Imperial Connection. As we prepared for the final ritual, Marcus revealed a truth that shook me to my very core. The Severus family's connection to the imperial court was not merely political. It was born of necessity, a carefully maintained alliance that had protected the keeper's secrets for generations. But more than that, the current emperor himself, Hadrian, was not just aware of their activities, he was dependent upon them. "You must understand, Lucius," Marcus said as he began arranging the ritual implements around Lyra's sarcophagus. "The power that Rome wields across the known world is not built solely on military might and political cunning. There are forces at work in the empire that require management, forces that would tear apart the very fabric of civilization if left unchecked." Claudia produced a scroll case made from what appeared to be solid gold, its surface covered with imperial seals that I recognized as authentic. Hadrian commissioned this himself, after an incident in Britannia that nearly cost him his sanity. He had been exploring the northern territories, seeking to understand the strange reports coming from his legions about creatures that attacked in the night and vanished with the dawn. What he found there convinced him that Rome's greatest enemies were not the barbarian tribes, but things that existed beyond the reach of sword and shield. She unrolled the document, revealing text written in the emperor's own hand. Even by torchlight, I could see the tremor in the letters, the way the ink had been pressed deep into the parchment by a hand that shook with fear or exhaustion. The content was even more disturbing than the manner of its writing. "By imperial decree," I read aloud, my voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "The family Severus is granted authority to act in matters pertaining to the security of the realm against threats that exist beyond the understanding of mortal men. They are empowered to requisition any resources, command any personnel, and take any actions deemed necessary to maintain the barriers between our world and those realms that would see it destroyed. Gaius took up the explanation. The incident in Britannia was not the first time the emperor had encountered evidence of the entities we guard against. Throughout his reign, there have been reports from across the empire. Entire legions found dead with no wounds upon them. Cities where every living soul vanished in a single night. Temples where priests went mad from visions of things that should not exist. Hadrian realized that Rome's expansion had brought it into contact with forces that previous emperors had been fortunate enough to avoid. The implications were staggering. The Roman Empire, the greatest military and political power the world had ever known, was secretly dependent upon a handful of families who guarded against threats that most people could never even imagine. And now I was being made part of that conspiracy, bound by oaths and rituals to protect secrets that could topple governments. But why reveal this to me? I asked. Surely such knowledge makes me a liability rather than an asset. Marcus smiled grimly. Because, Lucius, you are about to become more than just a guardian of Lyra's tomb. The ritual we perform tonight will make you a permanent agent of the imperial will, bound to serve not just our family, but the empire itself in matters relating to these hidden threats. Your skills as an embalmer, combined with your new knowledge of the entities, will make you invaluable in dealing with incidents that occur throughout the eastern provinces. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This was not simply about burying a young woman with unusual gifts. I was being recruited into a secret organization that served as the Empire's supernatural intelligence network. The gold they had paid me was not just compensation for my services, but an advance on a lifetime of dangerous work that would take me to the darkest corners of the Roman world. Claudia began preparing the final elements of the ritual, mixing substances that glowed with their own inner light, and arranging them in patterns around the black granite sarcophagus. The binding we create tonight will serve multiple purposes, she explained. It will seal Lyra away from those who would exploit her power. But it will also create a network of protection that extends throughout the empire. Every person who participates in this ritual becomes a node in that network, able to sense when the entities are active and respond accordingly. As she spoke, I began to understand the true scope of what the keepers had built over the century. This was not just a single family guarding a single secret. It was an entire hidden infrastructure dedicated to protecting humanity from threats that existed beyond normal understanding. And the Roman Empire, with its vast network of roads, its efficient communication systems, and its disciplined military, provided the perfect framework for such an organization to operate. How many others are there? I asked. How many people throughout the empire know what we know? Fewer than you might think, but more than you might hope, Gaius replied. In each major city, there are perhaps 3 or 4 individuals who have been brought into the network. They might be merchants who can travel freely without suspicion, or priests who have access to ancient texts, or craftsmen whose skills are needed for special projects. Each knows only what they need to know to perform their role, but together they form a web of watchers and guardians that spans from Britannia to Egypt. The ritual was ready to begin now, and I could feel the weight of destiny settling over me like a burial shroud. But before we could proceed, Marcus had one final revelation that would change everything I thought I understood about the nature of the threat we faced. There is something else you must know, Lucius, he said, his voice heavy with the burden of terrible knowledge. The entities we guard against are not simply random monsters seeking to invade our world. They are organized, intelligent, and they have been planning their assault on our reality for millennia. What we do tonight is not just about protecting Lyra. It is about preventing the opening of a gateway that would allow their armies to pour through into our world. He gestured toward the ancient sarcophagi that surrounded us. Each of these tombs contains not just a keeper, but a piece of a larger puzzle. The entities have been trying to collect these pieces for centuries, using human agents who may not even realize they are being manipulated. If they ever succeed in gathering all 7 amulets in one place, they will have the power to tear open a permanent rift between dimensions. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. We were not just dealing with supernatural threats, but with a war that had been raging in secret for thousands of years. A conflict between humanity and entities that viewed our entire species as nothing more than obstacles to be removed or tools to be used. As I prepared to take my place in the ritual circle, I realized that my life as a simple embalmer in Alexandria was over. Whatever emerged from this chamber would be something new, something bound to purposes larger than any individual life. The transformation was about to begin, and there would be no going back. But the ritual itself, and the price I would pay for the knowledge I now carried, would prove to be more profound than anything I could have imagined. The binding that was about to take place would not just seal Lyra away. It would fundamentally alter the nature of my own existence, making me something more than human but less than divine, a guardian standing watch at the threshold between worlds. Chapter 6. Sealed in stone. The ritual began at the moment when the moon reached its zenith directly above the chamber, its light filtering down through hidden openings in the rock to illuminate the black granite sarcophagus. Claudia had arranged 7 circles of power around the tomb, each one corresponding to one of the ancient amulets, and marked with symbols that seemed to burn themselves into my vision. Even when I closed my eyes, I took my position at the head of the sarcophagus, while Marcus, Claudia, and Gaius arranged themselves at the cardinal points around the chamber. The air itself seemed to thicken as Claudia began the incantation, speaking words in that ancient tongue that predated all known languages. As she chanted, the symbols carved into the chamber walls began to glow with a soft, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat. The first phase of the ritual involved the placement of Lyra's body within the sarcophagus. But this was not simply a matter of laying her to rest. Each movement had to be precise. Each gesture performed according to patterns that had been perfected over millennia. As we lifted her wrapped form, I felt the amulet's power pulsing through the linen bindings, a warmth that seemed to reach directly into my soul. As soon as Lyra was positioned within the granite tomb, our breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost formed on the stone surfaces around us. But this was not natural cold. It was the chill of spaces between worlds, the icy touch of entities that existed in realms where warmth and light had never penetrated. "They know what we are doing," Gaius said through chattering teeth. "They are trying to interfere with the binding." Claudia's chanting intensified, her voice taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical. The glowing symbols on the walls pulsed brighter, pushing back against the encroaching cold. But I could see the strain was enormous. Sweat froze on her forehead even as it formed, and her hands trembled with the effort of maintaining the protective wards. The second phase required my direct participation, Following Claudia's whispered instructions, I placed my hands on the amulet that lay against Lyra's heart. The moment my skin made contact with the ancient metal, the world exploded into visions that threatened to shatter my sanity. I saw the birth of the universe, the formation of the first stars, the cooling of primordial worlds where life began to stir in cosmic oceans. But I also saw the spaces between, the dark realms where entities older than time itself waited with infinite patience for opportunities to spread their influence into younger realities. I witnessed the first contact between these beings and primitive humans, saw how knowledge was traded for power, how civilizations rose and fell based on their ability to resist or succumb to otherworldly temptations. Through it all, I saw the keepers, generation after generation of men and women who sacrificed everything to maintain the barriers between worlds. I watched them build the first temples, forge the first amulets, establish the bloodlines that would carry their burden through the ages, and I saw what happened to those who failed in their duty. Entire civilizations consumed by entities that poured through unguarded gateways, worlds left as empty husks drifting in the cosmic void. But the visions also showed me something else. A future where the barriers would weaken, where the ancient seals would begin to fail, where humanity would face its greatest test. I saw machines that could peer through solid stone, revealing secrets that had been hidden for millennia. I saw the tomb we were creating being opened by people who had no understanding of what they were unleashing. And I saw the consequences of that discovery rippling out across time like waves from a stone dropped in still water. You see it now? Claudia's voice reached me through the chaos of visions. You understand why the binding must be absolute, why the guardian must be willing to sacrifice everything to maintain the seal. The third phase of the ritual was the most dangerous. It required me to open my mind completely to the amulet's power, to allow it to forge a permanent connection between my consciousness and Lyra's sleeping spirit. The process was agonizing. I felt my sense of self being stretched across dimensions, parts of my soul being anchored in realms that existed outside normal space and time. As the connection formed, I began to understand the true nature of Lyra's sacrifice. She had not simply chosen to die. She had chosen to become a living seal, her consciousness serving as a lock that could only be opened by someone with the knowledge and power to safely contain what lay beyond. But that lock required a key, and I was being transformed into that key, bound to her across the centuries by ties that transcended death itself. The final phase involved the sealing of the sarcophagus itself. This was not accomplished through simple physical means. The granite lid was held in place by forces that existed beyond the material world. As Marcus and Gaius guided the massive stone cover into position, Claudia performed the ultimate binding, speaking words that seemed to rewrite the very laws of reality within the chamber. The moment the lid settled into place, I felt something fundamental change within me. The glowing marks on my hands spread up my arms, creating a network of symbols that would remain invisible to normal sight but would mark me forever as a guardian of the threshold. More than that, I could suddenly sense the presence of every other guardian throughout the empire, feel the pulse of the network that connected us all in our shared duty. But the transformation came with a price that I was only beginning to understand. Part of my consciousness now existed within the sealed chamber, standing eternal watch over Lyra's sleeping form. I would live out my normal lifespan in the world above, but I would never again be entirely present in any single moment. part of me would always be here, in this timeless space between worlds, maintaining the vigil that would last for 2,000 years. "It is done," Claudia said, her voice barely above a whisper. The effort of the ritual had aged her visibly. Her hair was now completely silver, and lines of exhaustion marked her face. "The seal is complete, the guardian is bound, and the secret is safe. But remember, Lucius, this is not an ending, but a beginning. Your real work starts now." As we prepared to leave the chamber, sealing the entrance behind us with wards that would hide it from discovery for millennia, I realized that I was no longer the same man who had entered my workshop that evening. I had become something new, something that existed partially in multiple realities, bound by oaths and rituals to purposes that stretched far beyond my own mortal life. The journey back to Alexandria passed in a blur of exhaustion and revelation, but even as we returned to the world of the living, I could feel the weight of my new responsibilities settling over me like a mantle. I was now part of something vast and ancient, a guardian in an eternal war that most of humanity would never know was being fought. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear Lyra's voice, speaking across the centuries to warn me of what was to come. The seal would hold for 2,000 years, but it would not hold forever. And when it finally failed, when the archaeologists of a distant future breached the chamber and awakened what slept within, I would be there to guide them through the crisis that would follow. But that crisis, and the role I would play in it, lay far in the future. For now, I had to learn to live with the knowledge I carried, to serve the empire in ways that few would ever understand, and to prepare for the day when the ancient war would finally come into the light. Chapter 7. The Dynasty's Fall. In the years that followed the sealing of Lyra's tomb, I learned that the Severus family's sacrifice had been even greater than I initially understood. The ritual had not only bound me to the secret, it had fundamentally altered the fate of their entire bloodline. Within a decade of that night in the chamber, the family that had once stood at the pinnacle of Roman society in Egypt began to experience a series of tragedies that would ultimately lead to their complete disappearance from history. The first sign came 3 years after the burial, when Gaius was found dead in his study, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. But I, with my new sight, could see the truth that others missed. His spirit had been partially anchored to the chamber, just as mine had been, and the strain of existing in multiple realities simultaneously had eventually proven too much for his mortal form to bear. He had not died of natural causes. He had been consumed by the very forces he had helped to contain. Marcus lasted longer, perhaps because his connection to the imperial court provided him with resources and protections that others lacked. But even he could not escape the price of the knowledge he carried. I watched him age rapidly over the span of just 5 years, his hair turning white and his face becoming lined with the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. He began to speak of visions that came to him in dreams, warnings from the entities that still sought ways to breach the barriers we had created. "They know where she lies," he told me during one of our clandestine meetings in the ruins of the old quarry. "They can sense the amulet's power even through all our protections. And they are patient. They can wait centuries, millennia if necessary, for the right opportunity to claim what they seek." Claudia proved to be the most resilient of the family, perhaps because her bloodline had been dealing with such burdens for countless generations. But even she was not immune to the consequences of what we had done. The tattoos on her skin began to change, the symbols shifting and evolving as if they were alive. She told me that they were recording everything, every entity encountered, every threat neutralized, every secret discovered. When she died, that knowledge would be transferred to the next generation of keepers, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of millennia would not be lost. But there would be no next generation for the Severus family. The ritual had rendered them all sterile, unable to produce children who might carry on their bloodline. This was not an accident or an unforeseen consequence. It was a deliberate part of the binding, designed to ensure that the specific knowledge they carried would die with them, preventing it from being passed down to those who might not have the strength to bear such burdens. As the family dwindled, I found myself taking on more and more of their responsibilities. The network of guardians throughout the empire began to report to me directly, sending coded messages that described incidents and threats that required immediate attention. I traveled constantly in those years, moving from province to province under various cover identities, dealing with situations that ranged from simple hauntings to full-scale incursions by entities that had found temporary footholds in our reality. Each mission taught me more about the true scope of the threat we faced. The entities were not random monsters seeking to cause chaos. They were organized, intelligent, and following a carefully orchestrated plan that spanned millennia. They had been seeding our world with influences for centuries, gradually weakening the barriers between dimensions and preparing for a final assault that would allow them to establish permanent colonies in our reality. The most disturbing discovery came during an investigation in Gaul, where an entire Roman settlement had been found empty, its inhabitants vanished without trace. Using the enhanced sight granted by my transformation, I could see the residual traces of what had happened. The entities had not simply killed the colonists, they had harvested them, extracting some essential quality that they needed for their own purposes. The bodies were left behind as empty shells, but the souls, the life force, the spark of consciousness that made them human, all of that had been taken to fuel the entity's efforts to break through into our world. It was during this investigation that I first encountered others like myself, individuals who had been transformed by contact with the ancient powers but who served different purposes within the hidden war. There was Julia, a priestess of Vesta who could see the threads of fate that connected all living things. There was Quintus, a centurion whose touch could banish entities back to their own realm. And there was Miriam, a Jewish mystic whose knowledge of ancient texts allowed her to predict when and where the next incursions would occur. Together, we formed a new kind of family, bound not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual understanding. We were the ones who stood watch in the spaces between worlds, the guardians who kept humanity safe from threats it could never comprehend. But we were also the ones who paid the price for that protection, sacrificing our normal lives, our relationships, our very humanity in service to a cause that would never be acknowledged or rewarded. As the years passed, I began to understand that the Severus family's fall from grace had been carefully orchestrated by the entities themselves. Unable to directly assault the tomb where Lyra lay sealed, they had instead focused their efforts on eliminating those who knew its location and understood its significance. The family's gradual decline and eventual extinction was not a side effect of the ritual. It was a deliberate campaign of supernatural warfare designed to leave the secret vulnerable to future exploitation. Marcus was the last of the family to die, succumbing finally to a wasting disease that no physician could diagnose or treat. But before his death, he summoned me to his bedside for a final conversation that would haunt me for the rest of my days. "The entities are learning, Lucius," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his labored breathing. "They are studying our methods, understanding our weaknesses, preparing for a time when they will no longer need to work in shadows. The seal we created will hold for centuries, but it will not hold forever. And when it fails, when the tomb is finally opened, the world will face a crisis unlike anything in human history." He pressed a final scroll into my hands, its surface covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "This contains the true prophecy, the vision that guided our actions that night in the chamber. It speaks of a time when the ancient powers will return, when the barriers between worlds will weaken, when humanity will be forced to confront the reality of what lies beyond the veil. That time is still centuries in the future. It will come, and when it does, you must be ready." With Marcus's death, the Severus family line came to an end, their name gradually fading from official records as if they had never existed at all. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. The seal held, the secret remained hidden, and the network of guardians continued to function even without their leadership. I became the keeper of their legacy, the sole surviving witness to what had transpired in that chamber beneath Alexandria. And as I settled into my new role as the primary guardian of Lyra's tomb, I began to prepare for the long vigil that lay ahead. 2,000 years of watching and waiting, of maintaining the seal against increasingly desperate attempts to breach it, of preparing for the day when the ancient war would finally emerge from the shadows into the light of day. But that day still lay far in the future, and there were immediate threats that required my attention. The entities had not given up their efforts to claim the amulet. If anything, the elimination of the Severus family had only made them more determined to succeed, and I was about to discover that their next attempt would be far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything they had tried before. What's your take on this ancient conspiracy? Do you think the entities are still active in our modern world? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing your theories about these mysterious forces. Chapter 8. Guardians of the Secret. With the Severus family gone, the responsibility for maintaining the network of guardians fell entirely to me. What I discovered in the process of taking over their operations was both inspiring and terrifying. The scope of the hidden war was far greater than I had ever imagined, and the number of people involved in fighting it was both larger and smaller than seemed possible. The network operated on a cellular structure that would have impressed any military strategist. Each guardian knew only a handful of others, connected through carefully maintained chains of communication that could be severed at any point without compromising the entire organization. Messages were passed through a complex system of coded letters, hidden symbols in merchant transactions, and even patterns in the arrangement of goods in market stalls. At the highest level were the anchors, individuals like myself, who had been directly transformed by contact with the ancient powers and who served as focal points for the network's activities. There were only 7 of us in the entire empire, each one bound to one of the 7 amulets and responsible for a specific geographical region. We communicated rarely and never met in person, but we could sense each other's presence across vast distances and coordinate our efforts through means that transcended normal space and time. Below the anchors were the watchers, men and women who had been trained to recognize the signs of entity activity, but who had not been fully initiated into the deeper mysteries. They included merchants who traveled the trade routes, soldiers stationed at remote outposts, priests who tended isolated temples, and scholars who studied ancient texts. Their job was to observe, report, and occasionally intervene in minor incidents that did not require the attention of higher-level guardians. At the base of the pyramid were the unknowing, ordinary citizens who had been subtly influenced to perform specific actions without understanding their true purpose. A farmer might be compelled to plant certain crops in particular patterns that would create protective symbols visible only from above. A stonemason might feel driven to carve specific designs into building foundations. A scribe might find himself copying texts that contained hidden protective spells. These people lived normal lives, never knowing that they were part of a vast supernatural defense network. Managing this network required skills I had never imagined I would need. I learned to forge documents, to speak a dozen different languages, to navigate the complex politics of provincial administration. I became an expert in ancient history, comparative religion, and what would later be called archaeology. Most importantly, I learned to live multiple lives simultaneously, maintaining different identities in different cities, while my true self remained anchored to the chamber where Lyra slept. The entities, meanwhile, were developing their own countermeasures. They began to infiltrate the network, using their ability to influence human minds to turn guardians against each other. I lost 3 watchers in Britannia when they were convinced that their colleagues were actually entity agents in disguise. A cell in Germania was completely destroyed when its members began experiencing shared nightmares that drove them to madness and suicide. Most disturbing of all was the discovery that some humans were willingly collaborating with the entities, trading their souls for power and knowledge that allowed them to live far beyond normal lifespan. These cultists, as I came to think of them, were often indistinguishable from ordinary citizens until they revealed their true nature through acts of sabotage or betrayal. One such incident occurred in Rome itself, when I discovered that a senator who had been providing intelligence to the network was actually working for the entities. Marcus Flavius Corvus had been feeding us false information for years, leading us to investigate phantom threats while real incursions went undetected. When I finally confronted him in his villa on the Palatine Hill, I found that he was no longer entirely human. His body had been altered by entity influence, giving him abilities that made him a formidable opponent. The battle that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before. Corvus could manipulate shadows, making them solid enough to strike with physical force. He could speak words that caused reality to bend and warp around him, creating pockets of space where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. Most terrifyingly, he could project his consciousness directly into my mind, showing me visions of what the world would become if the entities succeeded in their plans. I saw cities where humans lived as cattle, their life force harvested to power entity technologies that existed beyond our understanding. I witnessed the transformation of entire continents into staging areas for invasions of other dimensions. I experienced the final moments of civilizations that had fallen to entity influence, their last desperate attempts to resist being crushed by forces they could never hope to comprehend. But I also saw something that Corvus had not intended to show me. The entity's own fears and limitations. They were not invincible gods, but rather parasitic beings that required host realities to sustain themselves. Their own dimension was dying, consumed by eons of warfare and exploitation. They needed our world not just as a conquest, but as a refuge, and that desperation made them both more dangerous and more vulnerable than I had previously understood. The knowledge gained from that encounter allowed me to develop new strategies for combating entity influence. I began training guardians in mental disciplines that could resist psychic manipulation. I established protocols for identifying and eliminating cultist infiltrators. Most importantly, I started working on ways to turn the entity's own desperation against them, using their need for our reality as a weapon in our defense. But the most significant development came when I made contact with guardian networks in other parts of the world, groups that had been fighting the same war for just as long as we had, but using different methods and drawing on different sources of power. There were the Jade Guardians of the Han Dynasty, who used alchemical techniques to create barriers between dimensions. There were the Stone Singers of the Germanic tribes, who could literally reshape reality through the power of their voices. There were the Shadow Dancers of the African kingdoms, who moved between worlds as easily as walking from one room to another. Each group had developed its own approach to the problem, but all were fighting the same enemy. By sharing knowledge and coordinating our efforts, we began to achieve victories that would have been impossible for any single network to accomplish alone. We established a global communication system that allowed warnings to be passed from one side of the world to the other in a matter of days rather than months. We created joint task forces that could respond to major incursions regardless of where they occurred. Most importantly, we began to understand the entity's ultimate strategy. They were not simply trying to invade our reality at random points. They were working to weaken specific locations that served as anchor points for the dimensional barriers. If they could destroy enough of these anchors, they could cause a cascade failure that would bring down the entire system of protections that kept our worlds separate. Lyra's tomb was one of the most important of these anchor points, which explained why the entities had been so determined to claim the amulet she guarded. But it was not the only one. There were similar sites scattered across the globe, each one protected by its own network of guardians, each one under constant assault by forces that never tired and never gave up. As the centuries passed, I watched empires rise and fall, saw technologies develop that would have seemed like magic to my contemporaries, witnessed the gradual transformation of human civilization from a collection of isolated city-states to a truly global community. But through it all, the hidden war continued, fought in shadows and silence by guardians whose names would never be recorded in any history book. And always, in the back of my consciousness, I could feel Lyra's presence in her sealed chamber, waiting patiently for the day when the barriers would finally weaken enough for her to awaken. That day was still centuries in the future, but I could sense it approaching like a distant storm on the horizon. Inevitable, unstoppable, and potentially catastrophic for all of humanity. The preparations for that final confrontation had already begun, though most of the world remained blissfully unaware of what was coming. And I, the last guardian of the original secret, would have to ensure that when the time came, humanity would be ready to face the greatest threat it had ever encountered. Chapter 9 Year 2023 marked exactly 1900 years since Lyra's entombment, and I felt the approaching crisis like a physical weight pressing down on my consciousness. The signs had been building for decades. Archaeological expeditions were getting closer to the hidden chamber, their ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging revealing anomalies in the limestone that had once been perfectly concealed. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead archaeologist on the Alexandria Deep Survey project, had no idea that her work was being monitored by forces that existed beyond her understanding. Her team's discovery of the ancient quarry site had been carefully orchestrated by entity agents who had spent decades maneuvering themselves into positions of influence within the academic community. They had guided her research, provided funding for her expeditions, and ensured that she had access to the most advanced detection equipment available. I watched from the shadows as her team set up their equipment, using technologies that would have seemed like pure magic to the Romans who had first sealed the chamber. Their machines could see through solid rock, map underground spaces with perfect accuracy, and detect the faintest traces of organic material buried beneath tons of stone. The protections that had hidden Lyra's tomb for 2 millennia were powerless against instruments that operated according to principles the ancient keepers had never imagined. The first breach came on a Tuesday morning in late October. Dr. Chen's team had been using a new type of sonic imaging device to map what they believed was a natural cave system. When the machine's pulses penetrated the chamber's outer defenses, the feedback nearly destroyed their equipment and sent several team members to the hospital with severe headaches and temporary blindness. But the damage was done. The sonic waves had created tiny fractures in the protective barriers, allowing entity influence to begin seeping into our reality. Within hours, strange incidents began occurring throughout Alexandria. Electronic devices malfunctioned in specific patterns. Animals behaved erratically, and sensitive individuals reported disturbing dreams filled with images of vast, dark spaces populated by things that should not exist. I knew I had to act quickly. Using contacts I had cultivated within the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, I attempted to shut down the excavation, claiming that the site was too dangerous for continued exploration. But the entity agents had anticipated this move. They had positioned their own people within the bureaucracy, and my warnings were dismissed as the concerns of an overly cautious academic. The second breach occurred 3 days later, when Dr. Chen's team used a robotic probe to explore what their instruments indicated was a large underground chamber. The probe's cameras transmitted images that sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Perfectly preserved wall carvings, artifacts that predated known Egyptian civilization, and, most significantly, the outline of what appeared to be an intact sarcophagus made from black granite. What the cameras could not capture, but what I could sense through my connection to the chamber, was the sudden surge of entity activity. As the probe's lights illuminated spaces that had been dark for 2,000 years, the ancient bindings were weakening, and Lyra's consciousness was beginning to stir from its long sleep. The amulet's power, contained for so long, was starting to leak into the surrounding area like radiation from a breached reactor. I made the decision to reveal myself to Dr. Chen, knowing that it would expose me to enormous risk, but hoping that I could convince her to abandon the excavation before it was too late. I approached her at her hotel that evening, introducing myself as a specialist in ancient protective rituals who had been monitoring her work with growing concern. "Dr. Chen," I said, choosing my words carefully, "what you have found is not simply an archaeological site. It is a containment facility, built to hold something that was never meant to be disturbed. If you continue with this excavation, you will unleash forces that could threaten not just Alexandria, but the entire world." She listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in her eyes. To her, I was just another crank who believed that ancient sites were cursed or haunted. She had dealt with such people before, and she had learned to dismiss their warnings as superstition and pseudoscience. What she could not know was that in this case, the superstition was based on very real dangers that science was not yet equipped to understand. "I appreciate your concern," she replied, "but we're taking every precaution to preserve the integrity of the site. Whatever is down there has been waiting for nearly 2,000 years to be discovered. I think humanity deserves to know what our ancestors were trying to hide." Her words sent a chill through me, because they echoed almost exactly the arguments that entity agents had used throughout history to justify their interference with Guardian sight. The appeal to human curiosity, the suggestion that knowledge should never be suppressed, the implication that ancient peoples were primitive and superstitious. These were all standard tactics for manipulating well-meaning researchers into serving entity purposes. The third breach came the following week, when the excavation team finally broke through into the chamber itself. The moment their lights illuminated the interior space, alarms began sounding throughout the global Guardian network. Anchors on every continent felt the shock wave, as 2 millennia of careful containment suddenly began to collapse. I was there when they opened the chamber, standing among the crowd of researchers and officials who had gathered to witness what they believed would be one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. But while they saw only ancient artifacts and mysterious symbols, I could perceive the true scope of what was being unleashed. The entities were pouring through the weakened barriers like water through a broken dam. They remained invisible to normal sight, but I could see them spreading throughout the excavation site, taking possession of equipment, influencing the thoughts of researchers, and beginning the process of establishing a permanent foothold in our reality. Most terrifying of all was what I sensed from Lyra herself. Her consciousness was awakening after 2,000 years of sleep. But the process was not going as the ancient keepers had planned. The amulet's power had been corrupted by centuries of entity influence, and instead of serving as humanity's protector, she was becoming something else. A bridge between worlds that the entities could use to complete their invasion. As Dr. Chen and her team prepared to enter the chamber for the first time, I realized that all my centuries of preparation had led to this moment. The final battle of the hidden war was about to begin, and the fate of humanity would be determined by what happened in the next few hours. I had spent 2,000 years guarding this secret, maintaining the seals that kept the entities at bay, preparing for the day when the ancient protections would finally fail. Now that day had arrived, and I was the only one who understood what was really at stake. The chamber had been breached. The entities were mobilizing for their final assault, and somewhere in the darkness below, Lyra was beginning to wake up. The question was whether she would emerge as humanity's savior or as the instrument of its destruction. And that answer, dear listeners, would depend on choices that had yet to be made, battles that had yet to be fought, and sacrifices that would make everything that had come before seem small by comparison. The real story was just beginning, and the world would never be the same again. Chapter 10. Truth Unveiled. As Dr. Chen's team descended into the chamber for the first time, I followed at a distance, using abilities honed over 2 millennia to remain undetected, while staying close enough to intervene when the inevitable crisis occurred. The moment their feet touched the ancient stone floor, I felt Lyra's consciousness surge toward full awakening, her power responding to the presence of living humans after centuries of isolation. The team's excitement was palpable as they explored the chamber, documenting artifacts that would rewrite the history books and challenge everything archaeologists thought they knew about ancient civilizations. But their instruments were also detecting anomalies they couldn't explain. Temperature fluctuations that followed no natural pattern, electromagnetic readings that suggested the presence of unknown energy sources, and most disturbing of all, audio recordings that captured whispers in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. The preservation is incredible. Dr. Chen breathed as she approached Lyra's sarcophagus. It's as if this chamber exists outside of time itself. Look at these symbols. They're not Egyptian, not Roman, not anything in our databases. It's like we've discovered evidence of a completely unknown civilization. If only she knew how right she was. The symbols covering the walls and sarcophagus were indeed from an unknown civilization, one that had existed in the spaces between dimensions, one that had been fighting a war for the survival of reality itself. But as she began photographing the inscriptions, I could see the entities moving closer, drawn by the amulet's awakening power like moths to a flame. The first sign of trouble came when one of the graduate students, a young man named David, began acting strangely. He had been documenting the chamber's contents with meticulous care, but suddenly he stopped working and stood perfectly still, staring at the sarcophagus with an expression of rapt attention. When Dr. Chen called his name, he didn't respond. He simply continued staring, as if listening to something only he could hear. I recognized the signs immediately. David was being influenced by entity presence, his consciousness partially displaced by something that was using his body as a temporary vessel. If I didn't act quickly, he would become a permanent host, and the entities would have their first stable foothold in our reality in over 2,000 years. Moving with speed that surprised even me, I entered the chamber and approached the possessed student. The other team members barely noticed my presence. They were too focused on their work to pay attention to one more figure in the crowded space. But David's head turned toward me with mechanical precision, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Guardian," the entity said through David's lips, "you have maintained your vigil well. But your time is over. The barriers weaken, the seals fail, and soon our realm and yours shall be one. The girl's power will serve as the key to unlock all the doors you have worked so hard to keep closed." "Not while I still draw breath," I replied, speaking in the ancient tongue that the entities understood. "The oath I swore 2,000 years ago still binds me, and I will not allow you to claim what you seek." The confrontation that followed was invisible to the archaeological team, fought on levels of reality they couldn't perceive. The entity tried to use David's body to physically attack me, but I had learned techniques over the centuries that allowed me to counter such possession. Speaking words of power that had been old when Rome was young, I began the process of banishing the intruder back to its own dimension. But the entity's presence had served its purpose. It had been a distraction while other forces worked to complete the awakening process. As I fought to free David from possession, I felt the sarcophagus lid beginning to shift, moved not by physical force but by the power that was stirring within. Dr. Chen and her team watched in amazement as the massive granite cover began to slide aside, revealing the perfectly preserved form of a young woman who looked as if she had been sleeping for mere hours rather than 2 millennia. But I could see what they could not. The amulet at her throat was pulsing with increasing intensity, and the symbols carved into her wrappings were beginning to glow with their own inner light. "My God, Doctor," Chen whispered, She's beautiful. And look at that amulet. I've never seen metalwork like that. The craftsmanship is extraordinary." As she reached toward the amulet, I knew I had to reveal myself completely. There was no more time for subtlety or careful manipulation. The crisis was upon us, and only the truth, however impossible it might seem, could prevent the catastrophe that was about to unfold. "Don't touch it," I commanded, my voice carrying the authority of 2,000 years of guardianship. "That amulet is not a piece of jewelry. It's a key to forces that could destroy your entire civilization." The team turned toward me in surprise, finally noticing my presence in their midst. Dr. Chen's eyes narrowed as she studied my face, trying to place where she had seen me before. "You're the man from the hotel," she said slowly. "The one who warned me about continuing the excavation. How did you get down here? This site is supposed to be secure." "Security means nothing to someone who has been guarding this chamber since before your ancestors were born," I replied. "My name is Lucius, and I am the last of the keepers of the threshold. What you have found here is not an archaeological treasure, it is a prison, built to contain something that threatens the very fabric of reality." Even as I spoke, Lyra's eyes began to open, revealing pupils that held depths no human gaze had ever possessed. She sat up slowly, her movements graceful despite the centuries of immobility, and when she spoke, her voice carried echoes of dimensions beyond counting. "The seal is broken," she said, her words resonating through the chamber like the tolling of a great bell. "The barriers weaken, and the hungry ones press against the boundaries of our world. The time of choosing has come. Will humanity stand and fight, or will it fall to forces it cannot comprehend?" "Doctor?" Chen staggered backward, her scientific worldview crumbling in the face of impossibilities that no textbook had prepared her for. "This isn't possible," she stammered. "People don't survive for 2,000 years. This has to be some kind of hoax, some elaborate deception." But even as she spoke, the evidence of her senses was overwhelming her rational objections. The chamber was filling with presences that existed just beyond the edge of perception, and the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of otherworldly attention. The entities were gathering for their final assault, drawn by the amulet's power and the opportunity to finally claim the prize they had sought for millennia. Lyra rose from her sarcophagus, the ancient wrappings falling away to reveal clothing that seemed to be woven from starlight itself. The amulet at her throat pulsed brighter, and I could feel its power reaching out across dimensions, calling to the other 6 artifacts that had been hidden throughout the world. "The convergence begins," she said, her gaze meeting mine across the centuries. "The 7 keys will be gathered, the 7 seals will be opened, and the final battle will determine whether this reality survives or falls to the endless hunger of the void. As alarms began sounding throughout the excavation site, as military forces mobilized in response to readings that defied all explanation, as guardian networks around the world prepared for the crisis they had trained for across generations, I realized that my long vigil was finally coming to an end. The secret I had buried in a Roman sarcophagus 2,000 years ago was secret no more. The hidden war was about to become very public indeed, and humanity would have to face the truth about the forces that had shaped its history from the shadows. The age of concealment was over. The age of revelation had begun, and whether that revelation would lead to humanity's salvation or its destruction remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the world would never be the same again. The Embalmer's oath had been fulfilled, the Guardian's duty completed. And now it was time for a new chapter in the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between order and chaos, between the forces that sought to preserve reality and those that would see it consumed. The story you have heard tonight is not fiction, dear listeners. It is a warning, a preparation, and a call to arms. For the events I have described are not ancient history. They are tomorrow's headlines, waiting to unfold. And when they do, you will need to choose which side you stand on in the final battle for the soul of humanity itself. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through time and mystery. If this story has captivated you as much as it has me, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about these revelations. Do you believe that such forces could really exist in our world? Your engagement helps me bring you more of these amazing historical mysteries. So don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, sometimes the most incredible truths are hidden in plain sight.